はい、それでは、定刻となりましたので、
Now we would like to begin the Symposium on Best Practices of Nuclear Regulatory Framework. Thank you all very much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us today. My name is Taye from the General Planning Group of the IEEJ, and I'll be facilitating today's symposium. We will receive presentations on nuclear regulations. We are video recording this symposium, which will be posted on the website of IEEJ at a later date. Now, we would like to first call upon Mr. Terazawa Tatsuya, Chairman and CEO of the Institute, for opening remarks. Please. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out of very busy schedule. Also, thank you for distinguished speakers for joining us today from all over the world. And also, area members have also got together from different parts of Asia. Global warming and carbon neutrality are major challenges. They are very difficult to be achieved. So nuclear energy is zero carbon energy, and it has always been recognized. However, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and that drew attention to the energy security. Under such circumstances, in order to address the environmental issues as well as energy security, there is a heightening interest in nuclear and nuclear regulations. As you know, France has decided to build the new reactors, and they changed the policy. And also, the UK would build at maximum 8 new nuclear reactors. And also in East Europe, there are a lot of plans to invest into the nuclear energy. So this is a global trend in which there is an increasing interest in the nuclear energy. And if you turn your eyes to Japan, as you probably know, the Prime Minister Nishida and its cabinet is promoting the GX under its expert meeting. And there's been a lot of discussions around nuclear energy. And they have agreed that they need to facilitate the process of restart of the reactors. To date, 10 reactors have been restarted, including those existing 10 reactors. In total, 17 reactors will become operational. And secondly, in principle, at the moment, 40 years is the period for operation. And with the single extension, up to 60 years will be the operational years for the nuclear reactor. But now there's a potential for operating beyond 60 years. And also the advanced reactors will be introduced to replace the aged nuclear reactors. So those are the three major changes we are seeing under the Kishida administration. In Japan, the nuclear energy policy is transforming under the global situation. Since FY 2017, the IEEJ, in collaboration with the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area, has been conducting activities to foster understanding of nuclear power in the aftermath of Fukushima accident. As part of these activities, IEEJ invited overseas experts and officials from Southeast Asian countries who are considering the potential introduction of nuclear power to visit the site of the plant and to hold workshops to deepen understanding. But this needed to be suspended for 2 years due to pandemic. However, for the first time in 3 years, we have this opportunity to learn about the global trend in the nuclear industry, and we are delighted to have this opportunity, and we believe we are having this symposium and workshops in a very timely manner. So I talked about the Prime Minister Kishida's administration and the policy changes on 3 points, especially with regard to the restart of the reactors. The nuclear regulation and its framework will become very important, and also other 2 points, policy items, will be crucial as they are closely related to nuclear regulation. However, in order to facilitate the restart of the reactors, how we implement regulations would be very, very important. And today we are joined by Mr. Magwood. He has been heading the Energy Agency, DOE, and also he is heading the OECD NEA today, and he is one of the leading figures of the global nuclear regulation. He is joining us today from Paris, so we are very grateful. And Mr. Ramzi Ijama, for many years, he has worked at CNCE and also at the USA NRA, and also currently he is serving as Executive Vice President and Chief Regulatory Operations Office at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So he's leading the Canadian Nuclear Regulatory Framework. And the third distinguished speaker is Mr. Robert Campbell, over 30 years at ONR and at IEEA. He has held important positions. So he is an expert, the expert of the nuclear regulations. So from the US, from Canada, from the UK, we are joined by the foremost experts, and we would learn about the global best practices of the nuclear regulatory framework. So this will be a very important opportunity for us. And there are certain things I am interested in particular, among other things. In 2011, there was the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and it will soon be 12 years since the accident. And all these years, only 10 reactors were restarted, including the ones that are being built. There are 36 remaining reactors, meaning that 26 reactors are yet to be restarted, even after 12 years from the accident. The Prime Minister Kishida said that he would target restarting 17 reactors in the first phase. So the regulatory process needs to be facilitated to promote restarting of the reactors. And we would like to learn from the practices outside Japan to see how they are safely restarting the reactors. So we would like to learn from the presentations that are to follow. The second point I am interested in is that to realize carbon neutrality, nuclear energy is very important because it's a zero carbon energy. However, the capacity factor becomes very critical in controlling the CO2 emission, as well as import of the fossil fuels. Compared to other countries, Japan is experiencing relatively low capacity factor. As we ensure the safety, how can we improve the capacity factor? So that is another point that I would like to very much learn from the experts who are gathered today. The third point I'm interested in is the communication. So there's a regulatory authority, there's operators and manufacturers. All these stakeholders need to communicate closely. However, After the accident in 2011, we saw the establishment of the NRA, and it has become apparent that the communication is hard to be achieved. So as we ensure the independency and as we ensuring the safety, how can we see the good communication between the regulatory authority and operators? That is another area that we would like to explore. The fourth point I'm interested in is that we not only communicate with the operators, but the local municipalities and local citizens would be quite important stakeholders and as you try to restart the reactors. They need to feel secure. They need to have a peace of mind as they see the restart of the reactors. So from that perspective, how the nuclear authority can communicate with the local community, that's another big question. We will hear from the three distinguished speakers today. And so hopefully they will touch on those aforementioned points. And also we will have a Q&A session following the presentation. The moderator will be asking questions, but hopefully there will be interaction with the audience as well, because it's such a valuable opportunity. So hopefully that the three speakers will be prepared to answer to the questions from the audience. And hopefully that audience will be open and candid about their questions and concerns. So as I said, this is the first opportunity over 3 years, in 3 years. And as I said, it's a very timely symposium. And it is such a wonderful opportunity to have with the three distinguished experts of this industry and regulation, nuclear regulations. So hopefully the Japanese stakeholder will deepen their understanding in this field, and hopefully that the Southeastern officials and participants will also deepen their understanding as they foresee the future introduction of the nuclear energy into their countries. Thank you very much.
Mr. Terazawa, thank you very much. Now, I would like to first introduce the flow of today's symposium. We have three guest speakers who are the specialists on the nuclear regulations in major countries. They will be making presentations, and then we will have a Q&A session. In the first half of the Q&A, the moderator will be asking questions to the specialists, and then we will take questions from the floor. During the Q&A, if you have any question, please raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone to you. Now, without further ado, we'd like to move on to the presentation session. The first presentation will be given by Mr. William Magwood, Director General of OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. The floor is yours.
Ohayou gozaimasu. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. Let me begin by thanking the organizers, particularly IEEJ, for the invitation to appear with you today to talk about this important subject. The timing is very good. The world has changed a great deal in recent years. Before the pandemic, when I was visiting Japan on a regular basis, the conversation about nuclear energy was a very, let's say, limited conversation. There really wasn't much of a feeling that nuclear energy was going to expand at any time in the future. There was really a conversation about how long it was going to take to get existing plants back online, and the struggle to just move down the path of getting more and more of the reactors active again. And today, the situation is very different. Today, in Japan, I've talked to people over the last 2 days, And there is an excitement in the nuclear sector in Japan that I have not seen in probably 15 years. Not only is there enthusiasm about continuing the operation of existing plants, but really extending the lives of those plants beyond what people thought was possible just a few years ago. There's a strong conversation about building new plants, both light water reactors and advanced technologies, which was inconceivable just a short period of time ago. The public polling seems to suggest that, particularly in the context of the events in Ukraine, the public is much more welcoming the idea of nuclear energy than it was just a short period of time ago. So it's a very exciting time in Japan and really around the world. The countries that we deal with have shifted their policies in almost every country that we interact with. In Europe, a place where nuclear energy really wasn't part of the conversation at all, the winds have changed dramatically. Countries like Sweden, Belgium, UK, France are all talking about nuclear energy in a very vibrant way. Countries that had sworn away from nuclear energy, like Italy, are having vigorous debates about the future. In North America, the US and Canada are charging forward very aggressively with plans to build new advanced technologies. Around the world, and particularly in countries that have not built nuclear plants in the past, there is a great enthusiasm about the possibility of newcomers coming into the market in the Middle East, in Africa, Southeast Asia. So it really is a remarkable time. And in many respects, I think we're seeing an interest in nuclear that is unlike anything we have seen since really the Atoms for Peace era. So it's an exciting time. But it's always important, and I will always emphasize this, that the single most important thing for any country that wants to expand or build new nuclear power plants is to have a strong, independent regulatory organization to oversee those activities. Without that, no progress is possible. Without that strong regulator, the public would never have the confidence to allow industry to go explore new technologies. So it's very important at the outset that we stay very clearly and very firmly that nothing is more important than nuclear safety. Without nuclear safety, nothing else can move forward. So let's have the conversation today in that context and keeping that in mind. So let's talk about the NEA for just a bit, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The NEA has been around for about 65 years now. We are an agency under the framework of the OECD. And as such, we have member countries that represent the countries with the deepest experience in nuclear technology, nuclear regulation, nuclear research, nuclear policy. So we work with the countries that have the deepest expertise. And that conversation that we have with our member countries gets into very nuanced issues that perhaps newcomers would not be thinking about at their early stages of their development. Our countries that we work with are very interested in the future of nuclear energy. Most of them that we work with are talking about small modular reactors in the future and how to deal with the climate crisis. Some countries don't agree with that. Some of our members don't believe that nuclear is part of the future. They look in other directions. And that's fine. All countries have to make decisions about what their futures are going to be. Our job is to make sure that when they make those decisions, that they have the right information to be able to make good decisions. And that's really what the purpose of the NEA is. Our framework revolves around these standing committees of high-level experts. And I'm going to talk mostly about the nuclear safety today. And we have 3 committees that deal with nuclear safety issues. The Committee on Nuclear Regulatory Activities, which is led by, in most cases, head regulators for our member countries. The Committee on the Safety of Nuclear Installations is a more technical group that features the TSOs for the most part and the research organizations associated with nuclear regulation. And CRPPH, the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health, are the head people who are involved in radiological protection and emergency preparedness. So a lot of the comments I'm going to make today are based on things that these groups have been talking about over the last few years. And in addition to these groups, we also are home to the Multinational Design Evaluation Project, which has been around for going on 20 years, I guess. And some of the insights that we've gained in thinking about new plants and new technologies have fed back into the framework. And I'll draw from that as well. Now, the lead group, the CNRA, has recently gone through a major restructuring. And it's been very interesting to watch the regulators go through this agonizing process of restructuring the work of this committee, because it really reflects not just the work of the NEA, but how our members do nuclear regulation. And the CNRA has highlighted, as it's gone forward in its restructuring, first, a simplification to have a smaller number of working groups and working parties that report to the main committee, but really to have 5 main areas that they wanted to highlight. And these are very important to note. The importance of adequate nuclear skills and infrastructure for regulatory organizations, that's a big focus point for our members. The efficiency of activities related to safety, and we're going to talk a bit about that. Assuring the safe operation of current nuclear installations, and assuring safety for these new advanced designs and technologies that are coming to the market. And most importantly, in some sense, I think, understanding the human aspects of nuclear safety. And that's really been a hallmark of the work of the NEA in recent years. This work will cover a wide range of topics, but the themes, I think, will stand as we go forward from time to time. A lot of our work gets issued in the terms of reports and other documents, all of which are available on our website for you to look at. So as I talk, I won't cite specific documents, but feel free to go to the website and take a look at what the work has been in recent years. I think you'll find a lot of very good insights and knowledge on a wide range of nuclear safety issues. So as we are here in Japan, I'll take a moment to reflect that nuclear regulation has changed a lot in Japan in recent years. Before the accident, the group NISA, which was a part of METI, was the nuclear regulator. And there were many of us that had some concerns about having a nuclear regulator in the same organization as the group that promoted nuclear technology. Some of us made comments about this, but for the most part, it was a decision of the Japanese government as how they wanted to organize this, so we didn't criticize it. But obviously, one of the great lessons from the Fukushima accident was that there is the risk of too much engagement between the regulator and the promotional side when you're in the same organization. And many of the revelations that came out in the aftermath of the accident put the Japanese regulator in a very, very bad light, and one that created a lack of confidence across the public that we all recognize is going to take a long time to remediate. After the accident, I found myself in Japan at sometimes 5 times a year visiting members of the Diet committees, talking to members of the government about how to reform the nuclear regulator. I was a big advocate for having a commission, for example, and I had lots of very vigorous conversations with Japanese officials who were thinking maybe a single administrator is a better way to go than the commission. So we had lots of conversations about that. And then the NRA was formed. And I remember after NRA was formed, I spent a lot of time talking with the first chairman, Dr. Tanaka, about what the mission of the NRA was. And he was very clear. One of the things I liked about Chairman Tanaka was you always knew where he stood on absolutely everything. He was always very, very clear. And one thing that I remember that he said to me multiple times was that his number one job was to rebuild the credibility of the regulator in the minds of the public, and that nothing else in his mind was more important than that. And that was the approach that he took in formulating how NRA would do its work. And I think that was absolutely appropriate as a response to what happened on 3/11. Today, of course, the situation is somewhat different. Today, the crisis has passed. We are not in a crisis situation. So I think the question that many people have come to me about, and I know that has been discussed in Japan, is the framework and the approach taken in Japan appropriate to where we are today? And I'm not going to answer that question because it's not my question to answer. But what I'll say is that I would think that in the current context, it is the right time for NRA and the Japanese government and leadership to take a step back and to look at the overall framework and to see if there are places where changes could be made. In some respect, what I'll do today is just give you a general view as to what we think the global frameworks have to look like. And because the time is limited, I won't spend a lot of time on each individual issue, but I'll talk about them more generally. Most importantly, I think that nuclear regulators have to have a clear framework for decision making. And we talk in terms of safety goals. And one of the things that I think that any nuclear regulator needs to do is to have a very transparent, very clear set of principles that it uses for its internal decision making that it can communicate to its licensees and to the public at large. Having those goals is essential, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on that in just a moment. A good regulatory body also has to be self-critical. Are we doing things the right way? Are there areas for improvement? Are there things that we could do to communicate our decision-making more effectively? I think a good nuclear regulator is always asking those questions internally and admits it when it needs to make improvements. I think a good regulator also has to be prepared to deal with innovation. The world is not stagnant, and nuclear regulation can't be stagnant either. We are seeing new technologies, not just new reactor technologies, but artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing. And the rest of the world is adopting these technologies very rapidly. The nuclear sector has to adapt these technologies as well to be successful in the future, to be safer in the future. And nuclear regulators have to be prepared to address these new technologies. That is simply absolutely essential. So let me spend a minute talking about the framework and the area of safety goals. Whenever a nuclear regulator is starting its work, it's essential that you start with fundamental requirements. And these requirements come from a range of places. In some respect, they come from law and tradition that give the regulator its marching orders. And I'll speak a little bit from a U.S. perspective as a former commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I remember how important it was to highlight that our mission as a regulator was provide reasonable assurance of adequate protection. That phrase, which was in our key law, was a phrase you would hear quite often in the agency. Interpreting that, what does that mean, was then the job of the technical people. That led to the safety goal. And the safety goal, simply stated, was to say that cancer fatalities from any nuclear operation or accident had to be limited to 0.1% of the total fatalities caused by all other events in society, including smoking and other things. And translated, that came down to a core damage frequency of 10 to the minus fourth. And that became the basis of nuclear regulation. There's also the need to be focused on defense in depth. And I can tell I'm going to run out of time before I get through all this, but I'm going to keep going for a bit. But defense in depth is how nuclear regulators apply a degree of conservatism to the work to make sure that the systems that they rely on have independence and that they understand that there are barriers to protect the public from radiological releases. But all these have to also translate into lower level safety goals to assure that the systems, structures, and components that we rely on for safety can be measurably evaluated. And ultimately, this comes down to very technical, very specific, very facility and technology specific requirements that are both qualitative and quantitative that regulators can evaluate against. That's how regulators regulate against these types of goals. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I have like 3 minutes before they pull the plug on me, unfortunately. One of the things I will highlight, and I won't go through each slide in detail because time doesn't permit it, but I think it's important to recognize that regulators are public servants. That is their job. And as public servants, regulators' job is to really provide the public with assurance that nuclear operations are being conducted in the appropriate manner. There's a lot of tools that are used to do this, but at the end of the day, I think the mindset is important. The job is not to simply, blindly regulate and make sure people are following the rules. The job is to assure the public that things are safe and that things are being done in the appropriate manner. And that requires a lot of communication and transparency. But it also requires a mindset that to some degree, the regulator is also, in a sense, working, if not for the industry, but with the industry. The industry has a right to get decisions made in a consistent and regularized way without unnecessary delay. I think that's a very important mindset to take. Clear and consistent regulation is a hallmark of a good regulator. Regulators who surprise their licensees with new thoughts and new ideas without cause, it's not really seen to be a good regulator. But regulators also have to have the resources to make good decisions. And that's something that I think we are struggling with around the world as more and more people retire. It becomes very important to make sure that the expertise is in place in regulatory organizations. I'll conclude with this slide, I think. Are regulators and operators partners or adversaries? Well, in some sense, the answer is both. In some sense, they have to be partners because it's important to remember that the entities that are responsible for safety, first and foremost, are the operators. If regulators think their job is to assure safety and to be the one to make the decisions, then there's a problem. The operators are responsible for safety. The regulators are responsible for establishing requirements that can be measured and can be evaluated for the purpose of making good decisions and also assuring the public that safety is being maintained. There's a lot of different aspects to this that I think we'll talk about over the course of the day. I apologize for going on a little long, but I'll go ahead and conclude by saying, maybe with this last slide. And I won't speak to this, I'll just leave this for you to stare at, and I'll just conclude by saying that nuclear regulation isn't easy. Nuclear regulation is very difficult. It requires highly trained people. It requires resources. It requires the ability to make decisions in an appropriate fashion. But I think the most important thing, in my personal view, is for regulators to be able to make their decisions in a reproducible way based on a clear framework and in a transparent manner. If there's mystery about why a decision gets made, then there's a problem in the framework. And that's something that I think regulators around the world would agree with. The last comment I would make about this is that regulators around the world since 3/11 talk to each other, interact with each other, and learn from each other more than they ever have in the history of nuclear technology. Regulators today are so connected around the world in every major country that there's almost no daylight in perception and as far as when they consider risks and technologies, because they talk all the time. And this is a very, very good thing. And regulators who are globally engaged are better regulators. And I think that that's where I'll leave it today. And I'm looking forward to the conversation as we go for the rest of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd like to move on to the next speaker. So I'd like to invite Mr. Ramuzzi Jamal, Vice President and Chief Regulator Operations Office, Canadian Nuclear Safety Question. Please take the floor.
Good morning, colleagues. It's an honor to be with you here today. I will start with the fact that we're here to have a two-way discussion. It is not one-way discussion. And a lot of the topics I'll be talking about will be already addressed by Mr. Magwood with respect to the principal elements of a regulatory body. So I'll be going through the slide very, very quickly. But from a Canadian perspective, as the chairman mentioned, we are under a lot of pressure from policy perspective for nuclear. In Ontario alone, one province in Canada, the forecast for the need of nuclear energy is twice of the existing facilities that we have today. So we're looking at 18 large reactors in addition to all of the SMRs. So the platform is changing and the needs are changing. So who are we? I'm going to be very, very brief. The CNSC has been in existence for 75 years as a regulatory body. We regulate the three S's: safety, security, and safeguard. So what is our vision? And I would like to spend a little bit of time on this slide. We want to be a world-class regulator. Our vision is to be a modern regulator. We want to be robust. We are going to be, and we are, performance-based, and always continue to improve with respect to our performance base without compromise to safety. Our decision will be based on science. Our mandate is not economics nor politics policy. We will not be an impediment for innovation. We're going to enable innovation without compromise to safety. We want to continue to be a trusted regulator. The chairman talked about the role of the regulator in the community. We do go out to the community and meet with the community on a very frequent basis. We introduce ourselves and we extend and expand our engagement with the community if there are projects in their community. In addition to it, we promote internal regulatory safety culture, and we impose requirements on the operators for the safety culture. And we want to continue to be global leadership in cooperation with the rest of the world and nuclear regulatory bodies. As was mentioned by Mr. Magwood, and this is not scripted at all, but engagement with other regulatory bodies with respect to the challenges we're facing will not be unique to us, so collaboration is key. We want to be an agile organization, always ready for the capacity building. And I want to talk about agility. In Canada, we refurbished, and is still undergoing, every existing reactors at Bruce Power and OPG. So the refurbishment was the largest nuclear program in the world, $14 billion in Canadian perspective, and we were ready. Every reactor was refurbished on time, on budget, with the regulatory clarity and expectation without any delay. In addition to the agility that we have, many of you heard about a decision by OPG to shut down Pickering. Right now, we're facing with the fact that Pickering will no longer shut down. The provincial government is going to spend enormous amount of money, in my opinion, in order to assess feasibility of refurbishment for Pickering that was slated to close down. Well, what does this mean? It means we regulate everything from the rock all the way to the waste management, and as I mentioned, the 3 S's. So where are we going? We will continue to be performance-based, technology inclusive, from the fusion aspect to the repository final disposition aspect. Our regulatory framework is flexible and will be able to respond to industry changes. We take into consideration innovative regulatory approaches, and international regulatory cooperation and harmonization is key. We can learn from each other significantly. Public trust is key. We'll lose it in seconds. It will take years to build. And in Canada, we have the indigenous engagement is key, because in Canada, the UN DRIP has been adopted, or the United Nations on the indigenous right has been adopted as a law, and we are obligated as a representative of the Crown to take that into consideration. So as part of our engagement in the community, we bring along with us indigenous representation when we do environmental sampling. The CNSC regulatory framework starts with the Act. We have regulations, license conditions, and condition handbook, and regulatory documents. Again, I'm just going to go through quickly because of the time, because I would like to emphasize many things as we go through. The licenses, of course, are legal binding, and we put in place the bounding element with respect to the licensing basis or the safety case that's being presented. And the license is supported by this license condition handbook. And those are publicly available. Anyone is interested will provide it to you. The license condition handbook, some people think it's self-regulating by the industry. It is not. We send the bounding element by which the operator has to be within, and they can modify the operating procedures within the bound that is established by the license condition handbook. The license condition handbook, I'm not going to say it's my creation, but I was one of the first to put in place. And as long as we review the changes taken by the industry, if it is in the right direction, making it safer, we will allow them to do so. If it is outside the safety case or the licensing basis, will require approval from the Commission. This document is a staff document, and we report to the Commission of the changes. So the trust has been built between the Commission as a tribunal staff and industry. They understand their limitation with respect to enhancement of safe operation without requesting every time a modification. And this experience has diminished the significant administrative burden on the Commission itself, so that allows the industry to have flexibility within a bounding element. The licensing basis is self-explanatory. That sets the framework, and I want to not spend too much time on it, but that is what the licensee presents or the proponent presents becomes binding. So the whole application becomes the safety or the licensing basis by which is being approved by the Commission. We conduct technical assessment at all levels. We start from a pre-licensing perspective for innovative technology to the license application itself and the way forward. We do technical reviews. We comment back and forth with the applicant in a transparent manner. And then we go with the technical information that becomes our regulatory recommendation to the Commission. And then the hearing is done publicly. And sometimes our hearing process at the Commission is a public domain, webcasted live, currently is in a hybrid mode where interveners are allowed. And we've had Commission hearings for as long as 40 continuous days and to as little as 1 day. All this to say the public engagement transparency is key, and we take it very, very, very seriously. We have a transparent regulatory process. Like I said, I created the vendor design review or pre-licensing review. And at the time, the early days, Mr. Magwood, myself, we had a meeting in Ottawa on the margins of the RIC almost 10 years ago in order to establish the way forward under the NEA. So we start to look at how we can do pre-licensing or vendor design review based on what we expected at the time to be innovative process, meaning innovative technologies. We do environmental assessment for every stage of the license application, and those are becoming part of the licensing basis, and then we do compliance activity in order to ensure that the licensee is performing on the basis that was established by the Commission. Here's our tribunal, and then we have a full complement of Commission members, and they represent diverse from the medical field to the indigenous and to the public as a representation with respect to the decision making. And each Commission member acts independently of each other. The role of the President is only to break a tie if there is a tie in the vote, and that's the role of the President. So, what are we responsible for? Let me make it clear. Before the 311, we always looked at Japan as the place to look at trust, political acceptance with respect to nuclear energy. Post 311s, things have changed. The industry went one way and the regulator went the other way. But public trust has to be built over time. But I would like to remind, yes, the regulator has a role to play, and so does industry. The industry is not always sitting back, and you consider us, the regulator, as your biggest risk in every step of the way. That is true. If you look at any license or operators, the highest risk with respect to their operations is regulatory certainty and regulatory predictability. So you, the industry, has to build with the regulator that capability for trust and the public and the politicians. So the industry is, the operator is responsible for safety. All the regulator can do is just assess to make sure that everything is done within the regulatory element. We put emphasis on risk-informed decision-making. It starts from the Act itself. Our Act talks about prevention of unreasonable risk. Let me emphasize what does unreasonable risk means. It does not mean complete shutdown, because the lowest and the easiest way to prevent risk is to not allow operations. So the Act says unreasonable risk. So the fundamental principle is risk-informed decision-making, and we always apply the risk-informed approach. And the risk-informed approach requires a cultural change within the regulatory body in order to understand what is risk and what is an acceptable risk versus what is the nth degree of a technical evaluation with no value or return from a safety perspective. The fundamental principle of long-term operations for the large facility is PSR. And I want to say I'm not a diplomat nor politician, but I have a lot of experience from IRS missions, and I was part of the IEA team reviewing the Fukushima report. I'd just like to say the fundamental principle at the time was the industry was doing PSR. Neither the industry was improving on the findings of the PSR for continuous improvement, nor at the time the regulatory body was taking in consideration the findings of the PSR. Hence, that's what I say the gap that existed, but that gap has to be put together as we move forward. A lot of improvements has taken place, but there is always room for improvement. Because I always say to staff, an isolated regulatory body is the regulatory body that will not be able to function efficiently and effectively. Because if we do not know the industry plans and what we're facing, we will be getting into trouble with respect to our ability to respond to changes. We take in consideration continuously the effect of the environment on the project. And what does that mean? We review it based on any changes in the operation. We look at the changes of the climate change. In Canada, we have the tide is one of the largest tides in New Brunswick. On a daily basis, quote unquote, we have a tsunami equivalent of 15 meters every day. That's how big the tide is. In addition to that tide, what changes is taking place with respect to the future of the ice melting and the potential impact on environmental changes on the operations. All those are reviewed on a cyclical basis in order to make sure that we are able to foresee what's going on. As I mentioned before, we are not isolated, and the regulator should not be isolated. We do research. We collaborate with the research with the industry. As a matter of fact, we impose and drive research led by the government, but produced by the industry and the operators in order to provide us with regulatory information as we look towards the future from a regulatory perspective on any improvement. Not taking away the risk-informed decision-making, but any new evaluation we will take into consideration. What do? I have regular interactions with the industry. I have regular interactions with the industry. The interaction with the industry is based on many, many things. I meet regularly with the head of OPG, the head of Bruce Power, and any other vendor designers who are coming to Canada for them to understand our role and talk about the projects. We established transparent administrative protocols with the vendor design review. We published the service agreement with them, and we discuss with them on potential challenges that we foresee and they foresee with respect to their planned projects. And that is not limited to nuclear power plants. We meet with applicants and potential licensees for uranium mining facilities, new build, and we currently are the first G7 country who is assessing a license to construct of a GE Hitachi BWRX SMR. In addition to the facilities or utilities, we are right now assessing demonstration facility at Chalk River Laboratories for Global First Power and the eVinci reactor. So we establish processes to provide regulatory clarity and expectations to licensees and or designers through the vendor design review and administrative protocols. As I mentioned before, indigenous consultation is key. We are obligated by law that we take into consideration the impact on the indigenous communities. Many of the land in Canada, even though it's Crown-owned, but originally owned by the indigenous population. And like I mentioned, we take the indigenous knowledge into consideration with respect to our regulatory oversight, and we engage with them. So building a relationship is an ongoing process. I'm speaking to the industry. You are obligated, you the operator, to be out in your own community, not just the regulator, to build trust, to build action with the community, to understand what you're doing, and to understand your safety culture. What is it you're putting first? The safety of the community is key, and at the same time, your relationship with the regulator is key. And it's a balance. The regulator has to be tough. I've issued orders against large institutions and nuclear power plants. At the same time, when we got it wrong, we heard from the industry so that we can always learn from the fact that if we don't have enough information, we apply the graduated approach. So in other words, we have hold points in place by which the regulator and the licensee will review, and then we proceed without the compromise to safety. International cooperation is a must. We cannot be in isolation. We learn from each other continuously. And I conclude with an annex. I'm not sure if the presentation is available to anyone, but you can download it from our website or you can email me. I will be more than happy to provide it to you. But I'm just going to share with you the small modular action plan. The Canadian government politics right now takes into consideration the nuclear as part of the solution by which the Canada committed to the COP 28 or 27, sorry, by meeting our emission by 2030 to be balanced with respect to zero emission for CO2. And nuclear is part of the presentation, sorry, is part of the solution and part of the mix. Many provinces, because the energy in Canada is driven by the province or the equivalent of prefecture, have put together a collaboration agreement, and based on the outcome of the small modular reactor being GE Hitachi, there will be 4 other provinces installing, if everything done safely according to our requirements, will be installed in other provinces from Saskatchewan to Ontario and to New Brunswick. With this, I come to the conclusion and thank you for your attention.
Jamara-sama, どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Jamal. Now we would like to call upon Mr. Robert Campbell, who is currently the consultant and who is also the former UK senior nuclear safety regulator.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is my first visit to Japan, so thank you for inviting me. My name's Rob Campbell. I retired from ONR, the regulator in the UK, after 30 years service recently. So I'm looking forward to the discussions. I'll try and touch on some of the things that Professor Terazawa in advance sent, and perhaps a bit more detailed than you've heard so far from a practicing regulator who's been on the ground and spent almost 10 years as a site inspector, amongst many other things. So these are the areas I'm going to talk about. And I've just selected a few to promote questions and discussion. Regulatory efficiency, what helps to make regulators efficient? Communications with the licensees, and in the UK it's EDF, is one power plant licensee, but there are other licensees, 36 licensed sites. So how we communicate, mainly through the inspection, but again, I've just selected some items. It's by no means an exhaustive list of means of communication. And then finally, a little bit about communication with the public. But first of all, I want to talk about our framework, and it's a non-prescriptive goal-setting framework in the UK. It's different to many others. It's an acquired taste, as Bill Borchardt, head of the NRC, once said to me, who spent several IRS missions coming to the UK. So it's goal setting. The 36 standard license conditions, which have remained unchanged for 30 years and are there at every site, ask for adequate arrangements. And you may ask yourself, well, what does that mean, adequate arrangements? Well, that means relevant good practice, adopting modern standards, researching, all the things that we expect, that the public expect, that we know about as regulators and as vendors and operators of nuclear power stations. So although it's a very nebulous term, adequate arrangements, it does work in practice, and I hopefully will show you some of that. The safety case, again, this is not legally defined, but there's 2 license conditions that demand a safety case, and this is the totality of claims, arguments, evidence, research, anything that the licensee, potential licensee, wants to throw at ONR to consider to prove that there's an acceptable risk from either an existing plant or a new plant, or more recently SMRs that we have to consider. And then finally, just to mention the graded approach, as the IEEA call it, proportionate, targeted. It's not the regulator's job to look at everything that the operator is doing. It can't do it, hasn't got the resources, nor is it necessary. The operator is firmly legally responsible for safety, the regulator is not. So you have to sample and choose where you want to target your activities, target your inspection and attention and assessment. And that's what we do. The broad framework in Britain for following the Layfield public inquiry in the 80s, in 1988, we published a document called The Tolerability of Risk from Nuclear Power Stations. And this diagram, this inverted triangle, was the first time that was available. I've got the document, very well thumbed, but quite a seminal work. It puts risk in context of industrial risk, personal risk, and is a document for the public really to read and puts into the framework for regulation in the UK. And it exists now within our regulation, how we regulate. So there's at the top of that inverted triangle is in an acceptable region, a basic safety limit or basic safety level, where above that line, really, you cannot tolerate an installation. We do have some plants at Sellafield that are at that line, that are very old, have lots of waste open to the atmosphere, which are being remediated, which are right at that level. As you move down, there's an illegal duty to reduce risks so far as is reasonably practicable. The safety case should demonstrate that risks are reduced as far as reasonably practical, or a LARP or a LARA, as low as reasonably practical. So you drive down the risk towards the basic safety objective. And there are numerical targets for both the basic safety level and basic safety objectives. They're set out, not in law, again, not in law, but in guidance documents, and I'll mention that. So a new reactor, you would expect, if I get the pointer working, would come in really at the basic safety objective level. These are the old Magnox plants and some decommissioning facilities at Sellafield, but there's a duty on operators to drive down risk, to make improvements through PSRs, through modifications, through other means, to move towards the basic safety objective. That duty doesn't end at the BSO, it continues. However, the regulator will not expect the operator to spend any time, effort, money if it's sort of reached that broadly acceptable level of risk. So that's the sort of general framework that we adopted in the UK. So I just did that as a way of background, it's a very different approach to many other countries. So a couple of slides on efficiency of the regulatory body, an ONR. So early and constant dialogue with the operators and with licensees and requesting parties and potential licensees is absolutely essential on an almost daily basis, from both the technical assessment side, the inspector's side, and then issues that do emerge where there's a difficulty or there's a safety deficiency are logged, recorded, and that can come from anything, not just inspection, and graded, grade 1 being the highest. So things at Sellafield are grade 1 and get the attention of this chief nuclear inspector, and that's monitored at a very senior level down to grade 4, where an inspector can deal with it. He or she can deal with that on their own personal basis and doesn't have to resort to any particular management oversight, but has to use the database, a common database for all the inspectors, so that it's absolutely available to look at and interrogate should it be necessary. But I'd stress, and building on what's been said so far, dialogue is essential all the time between the operators and the licensees and the ONR. So we publish our safety assessment principles, and that inverted triangle, the ALARP triangle, is embedded in our safety assessment principles, and there are numerical targets that are in there. They're only targets, they're not legally binding, as I said, and in fact, the whole of the safety assessment principles are not legally binding. They're to inform the regulatory staff what to look for when it's judging the adequacy of the safety case. That's all it is. It's to help make that judgment of what is adequate and acceptable risk. Now, there's a suite of technical assessment guides to amplify what's, in essence, the safety assessment principles, and that's quite a sizable document on its own. It's about 250 pages, but there are many technical assessment guides which are all available on the website. And again, those are to help assessors, but obviously the licensee has access to them, so they know what the regulator is looking for in terms of the classic engineering principles: redundancy, diversity, segregation, common cause failure, single failure criterion. All the engineering principles that have served the industry very well over decades are in there, and the industry knows what to expect from the regulator. The expected timescales, again, this has been mentioned, it's incumbent on regulators to give a service level agreement, to use a sort of modern term, to tell the licensees how long it's going to take to make a decision, for instance, for a high category modification or a PSR that's been submitted. Now we say a year to assess a PSR and have findings published. For a category A modification, it may be 3 months to turn that round as a regulator. So the safety submission comes in, the clock starts to tick. It's not definite, but it's there. There's a clear expectation of how fast you can. Now, it depends on the quality of the safety case and the arguments, but there's a reasonable expectation that it'll be turned around in 3 months, for example. So we make that clear to the regulator, to the operators, to the licensees, how fast we can turn things around. But it's not fixed. There's no legal requirement. So it's very flexible, I would contend. But it does rely on judgment, individual judgment, more than, say, a prescriptive approach. Generic design assessment that we go through in the UK, and we've had 4 power stations had a generic design assessment. Very, very long, very onerous, quite difficult for the requesting parties if they've got plans, especially elsewhere, and we ask to make changes that they're a bit reluctant to make. But nevertheless, quite a rigorous process. Unfortunately, only one design, and that's the EPR at Hinkley Point, and hopefully Sizewell, which Hinkley Point is being built, that has gone through generic design assessment. Again, there's no legal requirement, there's a policy matter. But it's a very popular service. We currently have about 6 applications to enter GDA, and that comes through government for small modular reactors. I think ONR started to look at the Rolls-Royce SMR. There are others queuing up, but the regulator hasn't got the resource, frankly. ONR can't take 6 GDAs on at once. I mean, they take years and they're very thorough, but you can't do more than 1 or 2 at any one time. So that's the safety assessment principle. I mean, just to give you an indication of what they cover. I've got a copy of them, actually. But they're traditional, the whole life cycle is covered right through to decommissioning and clearing up the site. One thing I didn't mention about the license, it's for life. It's very hard to get rid of. You have to clean up the site to a very, very high standard to get rid of your license. So there's no expiry date on it. It goes all the way through. Again, some other features, the use of project inspectors to coordinate major pieces of work like the 10-yearly PSR or a Category 1 modification. That's sort of given to someone to add intelligence to coordinate the input of whatever technical assessors are looking at a particular submission from the licensee to make sure that things are on track, that assessors, because it's non-prescriptive, are not going off down a tunnel that perhaps is not necessary. And again, there's constant dialogue with the operator at any stage. So if a technical assessor has an issue, it's straight on to the operator to thrash out and come to a judgment. And what happens is there's a project assessment report produced for major pieces of work, which are published on the website that back up a decision. So the public knows the basis for a licensed instrument, a legal instrument for any regulatory decisions. A good management system, I think we know that, but we don't always observe it. But for consistency purposes between inspectors, for training, for knowledge management, a really up-to-date and comprehensive management system with guides, technical inspection guides for inspectors, tags, which I mentioned, and all the other dealing with incidents. It's really important, if you've got younger people joining an organization, that you have a very good management system, which has delegated authority. So who's making the decision? It really should be quite clear who makes the decision at what level. So we do have that in written form. And all, if not most of these, are available on the ONR website. And actually, the Google search function is the easiest way to find documents. We talked about self-assessment and peer review through IRS missions, but you need to review, learn, and improve. Everything doesn't go 100% right all of the time. There are often problems. Relationships with licensees can be difficult. So you need to reflect. Sometimes you sit back and learn some lessons internally, and that's true of any organization, but it's equally true for ONR and regulators, that they must be able to sit back and say, well, that didn't go so well. How should we change things? How can we do this better in the future? And there's also the peer reviews, the IRS missions, which are the principal vehicle for peer reviews, which is to see yourselves as others see us. The Scottish poet Robbie Burns quoted this: "It's good to see yourselves as others see you." And these are the messages to get other people to come in and give their view on your organisation. So I'll move on quickly to interactions with the operators. ONR doesn't have resident site inspectors. They're appointed for about 3 or 4 years. They travel. They spend typically a week, a month, depending on what's going on the site, but they're there every month for a week. And usually they meet with the station director at the end of the visit. They have many legal powers, more than you can count. Unfettered access anywhere, control room, diesel generator houses anywhere, at any time. Powers to stop things, but in reality, we hardly ever use our legal powers to enforce particularly. It's all done through persuasion, through dialogue, through trust and respect, really, between licensee and regulator. And then the other thing from an efficiency, from the inspectors, the judgment and the persuasion, is there's a split of planned inspection, about 80%, to 20% unannounced, unplanned inspection. So there would be at least 1 year, once a year, where inspector turns up and site just does not know they're turning up. They just turn up, and it might be in the evening, but they do a completely unannounced inspection. But during the week that an inspector's there, he or she will go in the control room, wander around, have a look at material condition, talk to people. So there's an element of free roaming about, just to get an idea of the culture and the conditions on the site. There are team inspections as well. Safety system, the plants are broken into different safety systems, and they're looked at by a small team about the training of the people, the maintenance of the plant. So sometimes there are those. And then every year there's an annual emergency exercise, which is the whole site is mustered, and there's a team of about 5 inspectors will observe the exercise and judge whether it is adequate or not, and whether it should be repeated if necessary, if it doesn't go very well. And sometimes they don't go very well, and they have to be repeated by the licensee. So there are team inspections. And then there's the annual review of safety, where the station director and the lead team, the management team, sit down and look back over safety performance over the year, what's gone well, what's not gone very well, and it's very honest and open. What could go better, what they need to change, what they need to focus on. So that too is a set piece where I used to go. That was my main visit to the site. I had a team of site inspectors, but that was where I'd get my view of overall performance of the site once a year, the annual review of safety. Then further interactions. I mean, what I'd say, to build on before, safety categorization, the licensee must categorize its modifications, its organizational change. It's absolutely important that it categorizes to sort out what's important to safety. Then consequently, for ONR and other regulators, it's key that we look at the Cat 1, the Cat A's, that they're almost certainly going to be looked at. But the Cat B's, Cat C's, Cat D's, really, you have access to them, but you wouldn't look at them. But the Cat 1s, the Cat A's, the most significant modifications, upgrades, PSR outcomes, you would definitely get involved and look at. So categorization is key to help the regulator. For periodic reactor shutdown, for AGRs, advanced gas-cooled reactors, it's a 3-yearly shutdown. There's online refueling for AGRs. We've got 5 at the minute and 1 PWR. Sizewell B is about to shut down for a 2-month outage, which is quite long. Refueling purposes principally, but there's other work on the steam side to do. So it varies between 1 and 3 months, how long is a periodic shutdown. And then clearly there'll be more inspection, because there's a lot of contractors, a lot of other work going on that ONR will look at. For PWRs, of course, you can't get in the containment until the outage, so there's a chance for the inspector to get into containment, because before that he or she has been looking at arrangements across the board of different areas. And there's plenty to look out while the reactor's at power, to be honest. There's plenty of areas where you can look at training, you can look at emergency preparedness, you can look at maintenance of other systems, you can get a feel for the culture. So there are many things that, you're not idle during that week you go to site, the PWR, so that there are other things you can do, but obviously opening containment's a big thing. But for the AGRs, it's different. It's a shutdown once every 3 years, typically between 1 and 2 months, and there is a lot of activity. It's double the size of the workforce. There are themed inspections at Chief Nuclear Inspector where a team will go across sites, across licensees, and the last one I think was aging management. And then there are routine meetings at different levels, 4 levels, and the Chief Nuclear Inspector, for example, would meet with the EDF CEO once a year. And this is a vehicle for escalating. If issues are not being resolved at lower levels, then this is an escalation means for issues to go right up to the top and for the Chief Inspector to say, look, you need to sort this out in a very polite way and constructive manner. So it's about mutual respect, trust, constant dialogue, openness, making things available to the public as far as possible is clearly very important. The regulator works for the public. You're a public servant as a regulator. And I'll move on, I think, finally to actually communications with the public. So most sites, there's a stakeholder group which is convened by the site and the local public. The ONR inspector writes a report, attends, will answer questions there. That is the main vehicle to talk to the local populace around the power station and any other of the licensed sites, actually, not just the power stations. So again, the report's available on the website. It's sent to the members in advance, but ONR is not a member of this group. This is for the plant and the people, with ONR there to answer questions as a representative on behalf of the people as a safety authority. That's an important distinction. So you don't sit in the meeting with the operator. You sit at the back and you stand up and you say, well, you've read my report, and sometimes there's a question, sometimes not. Depends on the site. Sizewell, for instance, is quite an active stakeholder group. Some are quite benign. Some only meet once or twice a year. But it's, again, non-statutory. It's a completely voluntary system, but it seems to work. Everything's available, disclosable under freedom of information, FOI. It's the same in many countries. So actually, even what ONR publishes, everything else can be requested and usually given up to any requesting party within 3 weeks. So actually anything ONR writes, and this is very important for regulators, be careful what you write, because it's all disclosable to the public. That should give confidence to the public, hopefully. Then the Chief Inspector and Chairman meet with national interest groups every 6 months in a big forum, usually in a hotel in the middle of the country, where anti-nuclear groups, others, stakeholders with an interest can ask questions of the Chief Inspector. So that seems to work quite well. The Chief Inspector does get a hard time occasionally and gets quite difficult questions. And then the Chief Inspector publishes an annual report on the safety of the industry. There's a lot of effort goes into that, and again, that's available, publicly available on the website as to what the opinion is of ONR, of the safety, security, safeguards, all the functions, transport, they're all covered in that annual report. So again, that should give confidence in the regulator, and it's for the public's consumption, really. It's written for the public's consumption. So I think I've gone over, but hopefully that gives you some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Campbell. We'd like to move on to Q&A, but before that, we'd like to rearrange the stage, so please wait for several minutes.
はい、それでは、お待たせしました。
Thank you for waiting. We'd like to take questions from the floor. So we have the Murakami area, the representative. So we'd like to invite the speakers here.
Margaret, Mr. Jama, Ms. Campbell, so please come up on stage.
Thank you very much. We'd like to move on to the question and answer. My name is Taiye Murakami. I'm from IEEJ. Thank you. Thank you very much. First, we'd like to I would like to raise two questions for the presenters. So this is a question meant for the supplementation of the lectures made. So when I say supplementary, it is not that this will determine the direction of the discussion, but maybe people in this audience are very much interested in what I'm going to ask. So that's the reason why I'm raising the question first and foremost to the three speakers rather. First, allow me to ask questions to the three speakers. So please note that the question is for all three of you, and so each one of you are required to answer. First question.
The first question is about the balance between the better use of nuclear energy or and more rapid or more faster review and safety review process of to the existing nuclear plants or the new construction projects and the public concern. Or, in other words, how should we keep the capacity factor of the nuclear power plant operation at a high level? High means high enough for electricity production for your country, high level, while adapting appropriate regulation. Appropriate means enough for keeping safety in such a level. So I would like to ask you all of three experts one by one. So the first, Mr. Magud, and first and the second, Mr. Jamo, and the thirdly, and Mr. Campbell. So Mr. Magud, please.
Thank you very much for an important and very broad question. Let me attempt to answer it this way. First, as I think all three of us had noted, the art of regulation is to find that balance. And that balance depends on a lot of factors. It certainly depends upon specific technical factors at the facilities that are being overseen, but it also depends on the legal and regulatory framework in which the regulator operates. And so the balance can be found through very quantitative means or very qualitative means, depending on the situation and the circumstances. So I don't think that every regulator approaches this exactly the same way. However, I think a general principle should be not that the regulator worries about necessarily capacity factors, but that the licensee can have a reasonable expectation to operate in a fashion where capacity factors are at a desired level, and then work with the regulator to understand what's necessary to enable that to go forward. And I think that that is a reasonable approach that regulators will understand. So it's up to the licensees to go to the regulator and say, here is what we expect to be able to do in terms of our operation. Tell us what it is that you require in order to allow this to happen. But it's not really the job of the regulator to worry about capacity factors. But it is the job of the regulator to be able to make consistent decisions on a clear basis. And I think I heard from all of three of us that having clear requirements that the operators can use to understand the regulator's goals is essential. Because if the regulator doesn't have clear goals that are easily transmitted to its licensees and really to the broader public, then there's no basis to make any decision. And so I think that's really the essence of it. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jamal?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll start with the high level, and I'd like to share with you a practical example we're currently going through in Canada. The balance is definitely driven by safety objectives and clear requirements by the regulator. What do I mean by safety objectives? It's the responsibility of the licensee to demonstrate that the safety objectives are met. When I say risk-informed, not prescriptive, it's up to them to demonstrate that they can exceed or in a manner that is probably different than what we require, but they give us the equivalency that the safety objectives are met. Hence, we review and we determine that the safety objectives are met. So we do not prescribe what they need to do. We have a requirement on what we expect, but the operator can propose another way or another method, and we evaluate in order to meet the safety objective. That's what I mean by risk-informed or even greater approach. I would like to share with you couple things. We spoke about capacity. Our mandate is not the capacity. Our mandate is to ensure that the safe operation is maintained at all levels. In Canada, we just faced, I'm not sure how many of you know from the pressurized heavy water reactor, we had the predictability of hydrogen uptake in the pressure tubes. We found out through testing and the model that the model and the assumptions of the model were not accurate. As a Chief Regulatory Operations Officer, I was faced by two things: order a shutdown or order a requirement by which that the licensee must take in order to demonstrate that they maintain the safety margin. So without going to the technical element, the potential HEQ could impact the fracture toughness of the pressure tube. So what we did, staff did the risk-informed decision-making, and as was mentioned by Mr. Magwood, the fact that we relied on two things: the judgment and the probabilistic safety assessment in order to determine what does this number mean with respect to the risk of that reactor. And we determined that more research is required. In the meantime, the safe operations are maintained. And we had public hearings from the Commission with respect to this decision-making, that the Commission approved what staff recommendation is based on risk-informed decision-making. We spoke about safety objectives. The Commission hired on its own an external advisory committee to review what staff recommendations are. And that external advisory committee gave the assessment of what staff is doing, and it was a direct relationship to the Commission, had nothing to do with the staff. So in conclusion, safety objectives is paramount. Risk-informed decision-making is key, because our job is not to prevent risk, but to prevent unreasonable risk. So the safety margins were demonstrated to be maintained, hence allow the research and the decision to continue with respect to fracture toughness. There will be more tests to be done, and the remodel has to be updated with respect to what does it mean from a safety perspective. We know as we speak today that the system and the shutdown system will operate safely in case of there is a rupture, and that was one of the elements with respect to defense in depth. We evaluated every level in the defense in depth, and we'll recognize which ones will be eroded or there is potential erosion. However, the rest of the defense in depth layer were adequate enough to maintain safety.
Thank you very much. And then Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. The capacity factor is not something for the regulator. That's for the operator principally. Is this on? Yes. Yeah. Close. Sorry. Yeah. Capacity factor is not a fact for the regulator to deal with. A reliable plant is often cited as a safe plant, not necessarily, but to get reliable plant, then you need to have a proper maintenance inspection, testing regime, obsolescence management, defect management, the human performance elements to avoid unnecessary trips from errors, including maintenance-induced errors. So there's lots go into keeping a reactor on the bars. A shutdown reactor, frankly, is a safer reactor than an operating reactor. Clearly, that's not in anyone's interest. So capacity factor, while not a primary consideration of a regulator, is sort of an indicator that and again, from inspectors going to site and getting to know the licensee, you get a feel for how well they're managing their plant condition. In the UK, the reason the advanced gas cooled reactors are shutting down and the Magnox before them is principally graphite cores, cracking in the graphite cores. This was always known to be the life-limiting feature of AGRs and the Magnox reactors, of which there is one in Japan actually, shut down long ago, Tokai. Makes them uneconomic because you have to inspect more frequently, shut down more frequently. So that's what's driving the 2030 decision to shut the remaining 5 AGRs. We can probably keep them running, but the licensee can make the safety case to the regulator. But it does mean more shutdowns, not the 3 early periodic shutdowns that I mentioned. For the most modern advanced gas-cooled reactors, those 3 early periods are met, more or less. But they are now exhibiting cracking that was unanticipated. So, through PSRs and through other means, merging issues, it's in everybody's interest to keep on top of those, but ultimately the regulator is primarily interested in the safety of the plant. The reliability is a secondary matter, but if the licensee runs the plant properly, maintains the plant properly, then the capacity factor should be good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to move on to the second question to 3 panelists.
All three, please. The second question is a preparedness to natural disasters. Natural disasters include some such like an earthquake, tsunami, and not only this, and flood or a mountain fire or anything else. So there are many kinds of natural disasters, even in new country, in the US and Canada or UK or in all of Europe. And then maybe some regulations must be necessary, mandatory. And however, I'm not sure if I can correct, but I'm correct. But maybe none of your country, US and Canada and the UK, would adapt too many regulations to prepare for preparedness to natural disasters. So, and I would like to ask all of you in your country on how to prepare for the natural disasters, many kinds of natural disasters, in minimum size of regulation, please. So Mr. Margaret.
So let me, and I'm not going to try to speak for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S., but I'll speak generically, and I might cite a couple of past instances related to the U.S. But as a general matter, regulators have a responsibility to understand the natural hazards facing each facility. And I think that this was always part of nuclear regulation, that was always clearly understood, that we had to understand the floods, the earthquakes, other parameters when a facility was sited in the first place, and certainly as it was constructed and operated, that those were always part of the parameters that would be considered for a facility. After 3/11, this was tremendously re-emphasized around the world, and regulators went through great pains to analyze natural hazards, and some of them were relatively straightforward, but many of them were highly complex, and it didn't require a change in regulation. I don't think any of us had to change our regulations to say go look at natural hazards, but the practical outcome of 3/11 was a re-evaluation of facilities, either through stress tests or some other exercise, or just orders to licensees to do reassessments. And what I found was that there was a new seriousness to particularly flooding events that, in the U.S. case, that was quite enlightening, because flooding proved to be much more complex than I thought it was. Water is pernicious. It has a way of going places you don't want it to go, and so in the aftermath of the Fukushima Daiichi experience, there was a huge effort to deal with flooding issues. The other issues were, again, certainly reassess seismic events and storm events and things like that, but most of those were not as difficult. One thing I'll point out, and this isn't exactly a natural hazard, but one that was very interesting and is related to flooding, was how to analyze dams, because in the U.S. there are a lot of large dams that are scattered around that are upstream of nuclear power plants, and that reached a very high level of interest, because the failure rate for dams from a regulatory standpoint by the people that regulate dams was much different from the failure rate allowed by nuclear regulators. And I think in one case we found that the dam regulators allowed for the possibility of a failure once every 1,000 years, which in nuclear power plant terms is completely unacceptable. So there had to be a lot of discussion about how to handle that. But none of this required change in regulation. It was really a matter of just reanalyzing these factors based on existing rules and regulations, but it was certainly reinforced after 3/11.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jamal?
Again, thank you for the question. As mentioned by Mr. Magwood, we did not change regulations. We always has performance-based. How we evaluate the external hazard has changed and look at it differently. I would like to start with the global level, because the CNSC will regulate all aspects of the nuclear industry and the full cycle. Like I mentioned, from the rock to the mine, all the way to the repository. So the high level is any event that occurs, let it be a dam failure for non-nuclear element. In British Columbia, we had a major dam failure. It's called Mount Poly. For non-uranium mine, it was for other types of mining that the dam failed. Since we have in Canada uranium mine tailings and the ability of storing of the tailings, we have in-pit storage. We don't have too many above ground, but we conducted an assessment of the failure of the dam, even though it was not a nuclear event, to make sure that the dams used by our licensee, and it came out that the nuclear requirements far exceeds what the natural hazard or the requirements for a dam under the Canadian Dam Association. So we will never accept 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 at minimum. We have different requirements, so we adopted the requirements. And the latest experience from events, we did evaluate greatly the Boeing 737 issue, even though it's not nuclear, but we took the lessons learned with respect to management system, the safety culture. But I want to come back to the fact where we are in Canada with respect to the hazard assessment. Like I mentioned, we do it cyclical. The regulation did not change. We do it on a cycle basis. For nuclear power plants in northern part of Ontario, we required for them to have, for example, capability to withstand hurricanes level 2. The climate change has demonstrated that the capability of wind strength equal to 3 to 4. So the licensee is requested and was requested, and they updated their capability up to 3 and 4 level of the wind. And that is the cyclical review that we do not wait for 3 or 5 years, but based on the climate change information has been evaluated. Same thing with the flooding, same thing with the torrential rains and capability of the system in order to handle a significant amount. Post the event of 3/11, we did make a change, major change, that we impose on our licensees, to the point with respect to fire protection and the capability of maintaining cooling of the reactors. We impose on the licensee to have identical connectivity from all the sites put together. So in other words, if there is complete failure on one of the nuclear power plant site, or 4 or 5 units are going down, then they can get support from external off-site by which that they can connect seamlessly. And that is part of the emergency exercise where units come from other nuclear sites and they connect to the existing reactors in order to maintain cooling. That's one of the major factors with respect to the hazard. With respect to seismicity and GPA, there is the requirement, and we always look at the assessment from Canadian Geological Society and the rest of the world with respect to the impact on the hazard associated with the NPPs or any new requirements. All this to say, it's always on the move. We have in our requirements what we call a safety control area dedicated for environmental protection and capability to oversee on a continuous basis, and we do it continuously. And it becomes part of defense in depth requirements in addition to the technical element.
And thank you very much. And Mr. Campbell?
Thank you. After the Fukushima accident, we reviewed our SAPs and revised them, but we did find for external natural hazards that the requirement for a 1 in 10,000 year event to be considered in a design basis had been there for many, many years. And that was a fundamentally important principle, that you look back as far as is possible into the past. 10,000 years is a long time ago. There's not much written information. But nevertheless, you make any reasonable effort as a licensee to present arguments. Now, the UK is lucky. It's in the middle of a tectonic plate. Seismicity is not an issue, although the plants obviously are designed to withstand seismic to a much smaller degree than in Japan. But actually, I think the Fukushima accident and for other reactors, it wasn't the earthquake, it was obviously the tsunami that gave the problem. The plant shut down, the earthquake didn't cause the problem, it was the tsunami. And again, the UK is not subject to, it has tidal range but not tsunami. But predicting the future clearly is more difficult. So, you know, it's incumbent on licensees to look to climate change for sea level rises, we saw the hottest temperatures last year in the UK ever, so increased possibility of fire should be considered. The only plant that did a significant modification after Fukushima is Dungeness B, which built a 2-meter high wall around it. It re-looked at its flooding capability. It's on the Kent coast looking over France. Not a place you'd build a reactor, and it's not a place that another reactor would be built if you did it again, took the decision again. That plant has since shut down. It did have diesels in the basement, the only UK reactor with diesels under the ground level. No other reactor would have diesels below the ground level. So the future is more difficult than looking back in documented history. But for the UK, it's not such a big issue, but again, climate change could bring things that are unexpected. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And so,
Thank you very much. That's all from me. I have just completed my questions to the speakers. So we'd like to take some questions from the floor. Thank you for waiting. So at this point, we'd like to take your questions to the speakers. When you have a question, please raise your hand. The microphone will come to you. And please make sure you use Japanese or English, but the large number of the audience is Japanese, so you may want to speak in Japanese, and we have simultaneous translator who will put this into English. Since the translation is made, please make sure you speak slowly, clearly. That would be great. So, are there any questions from the floor? Please. Person in the third row in the center, please. Thank you very much. I am Narabayashi from Tokyo Institute of Technology. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. That was really precious. At the time of Fukushima, the accident, there was an inundation in the Fault Dune in the United Kingdom, and there was the flooding. So that's what I know. And I reported that related to the 3/11. Last year, there was the cold wave in Texas, and about 50%, there has been a freezing of the windmill, which had been providing the half of the power. So there was a blackout. And then back in Japan, last year, on the 16th of March, there was the problem. And then there was on the 16th of March, there had been some accidents in 4 units in Fukushima, and then after that there was a cold wave, and so there was a problem. So we have to avoid accidents, but at the same time we have to make sure that the blackouts should be avoided. In the case of a blackout, the nuclear power plants will lose its external sources, and also in European countries, there has been a rise of the gas prices, natural gas prices, but ultimately it is important to secure stable power source so that people will be able to continue affluent life. And at this moment in Japan, the prices of the power is rising at a very high, rapid pace. The KEPCO and the Kyushu Electric Power Company have already started the operation of nuclear power plants, but other companies have no other choice but to raise the rates for the people. So the responsibility of the regulator is to look into this situation, but at the same time, certainly it is important to pay attention to the accidents, but also the grid stability is also important, and also it is important to pay attention to the continuation of the people's lives, in the affluent lives. So could you tell us a bit about this? So this is a question to Mr. Magwood. Thank you very much. So this is a question to Mr. Magwood. So would you like to start answering this question, please?
It's a very good question to ask, and it's a question that I think that regulators often debate to some level. The bottom line is quite clearly that regulators are not responsible for electricity supply. There's other people that do that. So it's not really the role of the nuclear regulator to be concerned that if they make a safety decision that a plant will come offline and that will cause people problems through the lack of electricity. It's not the nuclear regulators' responsibility to do that. However, it is also true that nuclear regulators, good nuclear regulators, understand context. They know what is happening in the world. That doesn't mean that they warp their decisions around the needs of, for electricity supply, but it's important for them to understand the context. It's important for them to know that when they make a decision that has safety significance, that there will be a consequence of that, and that they understand that that's taking place. Because the reason that becomes important is that in some cases, and regulators I think do this, certainly in the US this has been done, there are issues that could be addressed immediately at a nuclear facility, which would mean taking it offline for a period of time. Or you can make the decision to say, look, this isn't that important, this can wait until the next outage, and then we will take care of this. That's a contextual decision that regulators make all the time. But I'm absolutely certain that if it was really safety significant and there was a clear threat to nuclear safety, that I don't think any regulator would hesitate to take a plant offline. But where there is enough of a judgment to be made, the context is important, and it's important that regulators be aware of that. Let me just add very quickly, and I did mean to mention this in response to Murakami-san's last question. When you're looking at issues like the freezing and other natural events, it's important to remember that regulators have to adapt to those as well. And as climate change and other things become more of a factor, it's important that the guidelines under which nuclear facilities operate evolve along with it. My colleagues here, both Canada and UK, use periodic safety reviews every 10 years. They look at the situation, probably even more frequently, and then make changes as you go forward. In the US framework, it is more when we learn something new, we take immediate action to implement a change. But whenever something happens, that is absorbed by the regulators. It is translated into guidance that goes into the facilities one way or another. And so every time something like that happens, we learn new knowledge and we adapt to it.
Thank you very much. At the beginning of your answer, you said it's not the responsibility of the regulator, but then that was followed by a very interesting answer from Mr. Magwood. So it was the question for Mr. Magwood. However, from the perspective of regulatory bodies, since we have two experts from the UK and also Canada, perhaps we would like to, maybe they have their own sort of unique comments that they can offer.
How do you think about the question from Professor Narabayashi?
Thank you for the question. I'll give you a practical experience. You've heard of the isotope crisis in Canada on the shutdown of a research reactor. At the time, the regulator's mandate was safety. However, the Canadian policy, the government of Canada at the time, they have the Parliament of Canada, who is the entity empowering the CNSC. It takes me, I'm just going to give some history on this, has required the regulator not to compromise safety, but to take into consideration the health of Canadians and the well-being of Canadians. So as part of our assessment, even though our mandate is not the fact that a high cost, but with respect to the decision, safety is paramount, but to look at the fact is what is the impact on the health of Canadians with respect to that decision making. So we evaluate and determine the fact that do we need to order a shutdown immediately, or what can be done progressively with respect to the regulatory requirement. So yes, we do take that into consideration, but not due to the cost. It's the well-being of Canadians. And that's why you would see many of the graded approach that we apply. The first and foremost is the safety, and no politicians, no ministers will have the right to interfere with the Commission decision. And historically, at no time, the government did reverse a decision of the regulator. It was more progressive towards what is it from a safety perspective, and that is key. So the Parliament still empowers the Commission to make its decision. But even our inspectors have the power to shut down a reactor, and they've done it. At the same time, all this will go through the legal process with respect to the appeal mechanism, let it be the federal court or the Commission as a tribunal.
はい、ありがとうございます。So then, Mr. Campbell, any comments?
Nothing really much to add. In the UK, there's a regulator called Ofgem that regulates the markets, the electricity markets. And actually, interestingly, EDF UK have just made record profits because the electricity price is pegged to the price of gas, which has been extremely high, as you know. So they've actually benefited financially from the difficulties with liquefied natural gas in the UK. But it's not something for the regulator, certainly not for ONR. Although that's not to say we haven't had discussions with Ofgem over the years, because sometimes, you know, it's been close to not enough power to have brownouts in the UK, but it isn't really a matter for ONR. And equally, if there was a safety issue that emerged, then we would close the reactor down. But actually, the licensee would do so. We've never had to really issue a direction to close a reactor down. Being close, but the licensee usually sees where this is going and closes the reactor down if there's a safety issue.
はい、ありがとうございました。そうしましたら、会場の方から他の。
Thank you very much. Now we would like to take other questions from the audience. Now, Mr. Terazawa, the chairman. This is Terazawa speaking. I have two questions to three panelists. One is about the risk. So today the participants are not in pursuit of zero risk. Mr. Magwad, you said the reasonable practical safety improvement. So you used the word reasonable. And Jamal-san, Mr. Jamal, said we need to avoid unreasonable risk. And then Mr. Campbell, you used the ALAP as low as reasonably practical risk. So what is reasonable? What is unreasonable? What is not acceptable? How do you make a judgment? If it's not zero risk, how you draw the line? That's my first question to meet the criteria. The second question about efficiency. So the reviews may be delayed, for example. Mr. Magwood, you said that we need to avoid unnecessary delays. But more specifically, how can we avoid the delays? And Mr. Jamal, more specifically, in pursuit of efficiency, you didn't really mention about how to avoid the delays in reviews, but in Canada, in order to improve efficiency and to avoid delays, what are the measures are you taking? And finally, Mr. Campbell, with regard to the reviews, you said the expected time scale need to be indicated. In case of Japan, the review for restart of the reactor take up to 12 years. When in the UK, when you conduct safety review for a restart of the reactors, what will be the expected time scale? So those are the questions to the three panelists.
Then I'd like to ask each of the panelists to answer these two questions from your perspective and regarding the initiatives in your countries and organizations. So in the same order, I ask Mr. Magwood and then Mr. Jamal and Mr. Campbell in this order. Mr. Magwood, please.
Thank you for the question. It's I don't think there's an easy answer to the question, but let me give you the history because answering that question in some respects has been the constant activity of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S. for 60 years. What is reasonable? As I mentioned, the formative legislation, the Atomic Energy Act, that created the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or its predecessor organization, the only guidance in law is that phrase I mentioned, reasonable assurance of adequate protection. That phrase is the only legal guidance that was given when nuclear regulation was created in the United States. And essentially, the work of the last 60 years has been interpreting that language to understand where that balance is. And as I mentioned, the key decision that was made in the 70s and 80s was to establish a safety goal. And the safety goal is this desire to, or this requirement that has interpreted that phrase to mean the cancer fatality of less than 0.1% of all cancer fatalities that would be experienced by people. And that was then translated into the core damage frequency of once every 10,000 years. That's the safety goal. That is the basis of which nuclear facilities operate in the U.S. And quite simply, there's a bright line there. And if there's a core damage frequency that is greater than once every 10,000 years, the facility is not allowed to operate in the United States. That will not meet the safety goal. So decisions that are made in that context. And the significance of a safety issue is measured against that safety goal. Does it measurably move you in the right direction or the wrong direction relative to the safety goal? Those are the kinds of decisions that are made. So what is reasonable is, and I will be honest, we try to quantify these things, but often it comes down to some level of judgment. But if there is a safety issue at a nuclear facility that degrades the ability of the facility to stay well above the safety goal, that is seen as a significant problem that has to be addressed. And a great debate that is taking place around regulatory organizations today is if you have a nuclear technology that is so safe because of its passive safety characteristics that instead of being anywhere near the 10 to the minus fourth core damage frequency, you're up at something like 10 to the minus 6 or 10 to the minus 7. What is a significant issue in a facility like that? That's a big debate that is still going on. So what reasonable means is constantly under discussion and interpretation. And that is really the work of regulators to find that balance. To your second question about the delays in decisions, I think it's fair to say that a good regulator is a regulator that holds itself to a high standard of decision making and doesn't create delays that don't improve safety. Licensees, and of course the U.S. tradition is different from other traditions, but in the U.S. tradition, companies, electric utilities have rights, and they have an expectation to be treated in a legal and reasonable way. And if they're not, they can go to the courts. They can sue if they think they're not being treated fairly. That's not true in all countries. But I do think as a general matter that licensees have a contract essentially with their regulator to provide information, to to obey the regulations and many other things. But I think the regulator also has a contract with the licensee to make fair decisions in a timely fashion. And if a regulator is unable to make timely decisions, then if there's a resource issue, that has to be addressed because we have to have well-resourced regulators. And if it's a management issue, then the regulator has to fix the management issue. But there is an expectation of reasonable and timely decision-making, and I think that should be true in all countries.
Thank you very much. Then Mr. Jamal, please.
Thank you for the question. And I'm not going to go through the numbers of risk established by Mr. Magwood because we adopt the same safety goals. It's key when Canada says unreasonable risk because there is a level of acceptance for the benefit of that reactor or that licensed activity. When I say benefit is with respect to the protection of the environment and the public. So there is we can talk about CD or core damage frequency, we can talk about release frequency. The safety goals are established as a fundamental objectives. And in Canada, we use the safety goals as one element, and then we put in place or target goals by which the licensee on their own, they put enhancement in place towards those numbers. But risk assessment and acceptable of risk is not easy. From a regulatory perspective, we say there is adequate safety margins, and in other words, it will not cause unreasonable risk. Well, what does this mean? It means a defense of the reactor, the 1 millisievert is protected, off-site environmental elements from release frequency are protected. All this to say, the number is a guidance as long as the safety margins and the defense in depth will act as designed. So the risk acceptance is a huge, huge complexity, and it is a huge friction in Canada. Many of the anti-nuclear, they do not accept what is an acceptable risk, because to them is zero risk is zero risk. And those are the interveners appearing before the commissions. They do not accept what staff recommendations are, that the safety of the operations is maintained, because many of the anti-nuclear activity says zero risk, shut down nuclear. So zero risk is, I will not accept your 10 to the minus 4. I will not accept 10 to the minus 6. It becomes an individual risk. So that's why we put in place the safety goals. At the same time, the safety goals are a guidance, objectives, in order to demonstrate that the defense in depth will be maintained at all levels. I will elaborate a bit more if I did not answer the question. With respect to the timelines, I'm going to take some time to use a language that will make sense. The refurbishment in Canada is equal to a new build activity. Everything is removed from the reactor. The only thing that is not touched is the containment and the concrete on the outside. So you ask, how long does it take to give approval for restart? I spoke about what I call administrative protocol. Administrative protocol establish the timeline by which the licensee must submit information to us, and the timelines we provide the licensees with the responses based on complete information. So far in Canada, like I mentioned, I can speak of a recent one, Darlington refurbishment. They've done 2 units completed, and the approval was established, and it was done on a 2-year basis, a restart. So in other words, I spoke about a graded approach. They established a safety report that resulted into generic assessment report. The licensee established what we call the integrated improvement plan as part of the refurbishment activity. That became the focus of the regulator by which the licensee must install and apply these improvements in place, and then they are given a restart. The restart of the reactor is given at my level. So in other words, the Commission will provide me with authority to say, as long as they are within the safety case, they can do the fuel load, 1%, and gradual restart. So all this to say, the timelines are not prescriptive, but they are established as part of the discussion with the licensee. We post those timelines and the agreements, I'm call them administrative protocol or an agreement or a service agreement, depending if it's a brand new technology coming on board, on our public website, and the public is seeing it. But we do not consult the public on this, and I do not consult with the Commission on these timelines. We establish the requirements with the applicant, and then we request approval to the Commission. So the key point here is key. You asked me about efficiency. Efficiency in Canada, let me give you an example. The nuclear power plants in Canada, we have 2 nuclear power plants in Canada that will be producing medical isotope out of a commercial nuclear power plant. Lutetium-177 and moly production out of Darlington. It's the first of a kind in the world that will be a nuclear power plant, electricity producing, NPP, will be producing medical isotope. What is our efficiency? Again, we establish the timelines between us and the licensee, because they are obligated to provide us with the information, and we are obligated to provide them with the response and clarity. That was done within approximately 10 months to put in place. How did we achieve efficiency? When I spoke about first of a kind, the technology that was being used in the nuclear power plant in Canada was based on a German design and German proven technology. We reviewed what the German has put in place, and we did not ask the applicant to redo all the research. So we've capitalized on available information that is credible, that met international requirements, let it be the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission, or the ISO, or any other organization. And we take on that information, and then we use it for our regulatory decision. So that's why I spoke about harmonization is key, and it's not to redo everything from scratch, because we tend to have a tendency in the nuclear bubble to reinvent the wheel or make the wheel spin for no reason. So that's one of the agility we demonstrated with respect to efficiency, and we are applying the same principle for the SMRs between us and the US NRC, and we imposed on the applicant to work together, OPG and TVA, so that the submission, even though to the CNSC, we're reviewing it a little bit ahead of US NRC from license to construct, to provide us with the gap analysis between the certification process of the AB or advanced boiling water reactor from the US versus what we currently have. Sorry for the long answer, but this is the efficiency we're talking about. Without taking away the national sovereignty for regulatory decision, we evaluate and we accept other mature regulators' capability in providing us with the technical information.
Mr. Campbell?
Thank you very much. Campbell?
Yes, just on reasonable practicability. In the UK, there was a judgment in 1974 that and ONR is a surrogate for a judge, because ultimately the court of law judges what's reasonably practical if it goes the wrong way. In nuclear, there's never been a court case which has tried to where licensees challenged the regulator. But the definition in law is, and I don't know if it helps, is that if the effort in time, trouble, and money is grossly disproportionate to the risk averted, then the operator, the duty holder, does not have to expend that money. So that's saying, if you go back to the inverted triangle I showed, if you're at the top level near the basic safety level where the risks are quite high, relatively high, then there's an expectation that you would spend more money, trouble, and effort to reduce the risk and drive the risk down towards the basic safety objective, the BSO. If you're down at the BSO, then there's less of a drive for you to spend money and effort driving the risk down, because you're at that area that people accept is broadly acceptable, almost where the regulator doesn't need to give any attention to it. So what it means in practice is adopting modern engineering principles, all the IEA standards, the expectations that regulators and the public have around the world for adopting modern standards, and comparing yourself. And there are plants that will never meet the BSO. You know, we have old plants running 40, 50 years that can never ever get risks down. For example, you wouldn't build a containment around an AGR reactor with a huge pre-stressed concrete pressure vessel. It would cost too much money. And the other thing is, feeding on then to the second question about how long can you let things go, 10, 12 years. I think in the UK, and it's my personal view, is the operator would probably shut the plant forever if it took 12 years. There are times where plants have been shut for 1 or 2 years for modifications, but that judgment of when enough is a difficult one, but that's what the regulator is paid to do, to say, stop asking questions, that risk is low enough to be acceptable, otherwise it's going to be economically unviable and the plant will shut. Now, for periodic shutdowns that I talked about, you're talking about weeks, you're not talking about, but for big, Haitian 1 had a big boiler modification which took 2 years and had to, a lot of effort, a lot of time was spent, but that reactor had many years to run in the future. So that money would be recouped, but if the licensee had judged that there wasn't enough life left in the reactor, they would just shut the reactor. So I don't know who's funding the reactors in Japan for that 12 years, but that is a long time to have something that's sitting there. There's obsolescence management. There's problems that you're going to have with equipment that you know is no longer made, was designed years ago. There's personnel who leave because they'll get, you know, they don't want to sit there on a site that's not much work going on, or it's frustrating them. So there are all these other aspects that you have to consider that make it more difficult the longer you leave it to restart the plant. But again, I'm speculating, but I think 12 years is really a long time to not restart a plant, because you're recommissioning the whole thing. It's almost, as Ramsey says, starting afresh, as if you've got a new reactor, because there's going to be a myriad of problems that have to be overcome the longer you leave it. And to convince the regulator. Obviously, they were safe to operate. They operated for years in Japan. All these reactors operated and were deemed to be acceptably safe. You've made improvements to them, certainly for, I think, seawall, for example, so raising the heights of seawalls. I'm sure that many other improvements have been made. So they're actually safer when they were first built and operated. So you've always got to have that, I think, in the back of your mind, and the regulator has. There are a lot of safety improvements that have been made that will feature in the decision, but it's counterbalanced by leaving it. More and more emerging issues could pop out. So that's what I'd say. But certainly, economically, there's probably lots of economists in the room. I'm an engineer, but it would be a very difficult decision economically.
Thank you very much. We are approaching towards the end of the Q&A session. So, Mr. Wozumi of the Nuclear Energy Council, President, is here with us. So we would like to invite Mr. Wozumi, representing this industry. We would like to have his comments on today's presentations. I actually wanted to ask a question, but I may include a little bit of a question element in my comment. Last year at the ANA forum, Mr. Magwood said that with regard to the new technology, the regulation should not serve as a barrier to the industry. and the new technology need to sort of be advanced. And that was something which left a deep impression on me. Over the past 12 months, we heard about the fuels, and we heard about the cladding, and we are moving forward in terms of holding conversation with the regulatory body as a representative ATENA. So with regard to the risks, how to understand risks and how to interpret risks, I think there still is a gap which needs to be filled. And hoping that there can be some advice that can be offered. So risk-informed decision concept and performance-based concept, and also the ALAP from the UK, and also although it was not mentioned today, in last year in the UK meeting, enabling a regulation was mentioned. So if you think about those things, in the regulatory framework, how can they be used, embedded in the decision-making platform, and how that can be implemented on the ground? That is very challenging. So we understand the concept. However, practicing concept on the ground actually proves to be very difficult. And just wondering whether you have any inputs that you can give me on that. Well, since it was a question, and we know that we are running out of time, maybe we would like to ask each speaker to maybe spend 1 minute offering some advice.
30 seconds or 40 seconds. Please speak shortly. So, Mr. Magwood?
I think that first, if I don't have another chance, I again want to thank all of you and Murakami-san for the conversation. It's been very good discussion this morning. Very briefly, I think that first, there's no simple answer to your question. But what I would say is that whenever there is a delay, and I'm not saying there is a delay, but if there is a delay in getting a regulatory decision, there are three things you can look at. You can look at the framework and question whether the framework is appropriate to the situation that it's being used to address. There is the resources that the regulator has. Do they have enough people with the right expertise to be able to process an application or a request from industry in an efficient manner? And then there is the management of the agency itself. I think all three of those can play into regulatory delays, and all three need to be looked at. And I think that's why, and I think my colleagues here have both indicated that a regulator has to be very self-critical and to look at itself in the respect of being an efficient, effective regulator. And I also do think that the international peer reviews, such as are held by the IEEA, are very important to try to look at issues like that. So there are all three of those can be looked at, all three of those can be a factor. And I think that for every regulator in the world, there's room for improvement in all three as well.
And thank you. And then Mr. Jamat, 1 minute.
I think your question with respect to the practicality, in addition to what Mr. Magwood said from a regulatory perspective, capacity building, readiness, and agility, we live them. We are living it today in Canada with respect to SMRs. We started with 13 vendor designs that they all came to us as a pre-licensing reviews. And part of the practicality is how are we getting ourselves ready? We did transform. With respect to right now, we are hiring for the SMRs, our readiness to continue capacity building. And the key point here, the early engagement with the licensee and the designer before the licensing process kicks in will mitigate a lot of the potential inability for the regulator to perform their work. And the regulator is capacity building, technical capability, and regulatory decisions.
Mr. Campbell?
Just to pick up on enabling regulation, on the first slide, I'd characterized the regime in the UK as flexible. It's the same thing, they're almost interchangeable. The way that we regulate the non-prescriptive is outcome-based, and indeed there are occasions where you must accept an increase in risk for a longer-term benefit, and that's particularly in decommissioning and at Sellafield, the big site in the northwest of England, where there are many hazards that need to be remediated, where acceptance of a higher level of risk for a period of years even to remediate plants which ultimately are, you know, unacceptable from that triangle point of view. So enabling has been used, and there's examples on the ONR website of how it's been applied, and it's outcome focused. But that we've been doing that for years. We've started calling it enabling, but it's the flexibility of the safety assessment principles and the technical assessment guides, which don't have to go. They're available for comment, they're publicly available, but they're easy to change relatively to regulations. We don't have we have regulations about occupational protection and off-site emergency arrangement, but everything else is through license conditions. And there's a UK regulators code, which is for all regulators, financial safety, which says that you shouldn't impede growth unduly, and you should recognize that businesses need to grow, but the principles, of course, are the same. The public expect extremely high standards when it comes to nuclear safety, more than any other industry, and that's clearly necessary. But there is this implicit assumption that you've got to let licensees and potential licensees to generate their business and grow their business and provide electricity, which we all desperately need. Reliable, secure funding and electricity into the future is a problem for many, many countries.
Thank you very much. Then I was supposed to make a policy recommendation, and I'm going to do that in 1 minute. I'll be quite brief. So the three panelists today had a discussion, and the keywords, I believe there were three keywords. One is efficiency, so efficiency and reasonability. So it's not to skip what's necessary. We do what we must do, but at the same time, we make decision promptly. And the second term was also mentioned by multiple panelists, communication and interaction. And it's not just about the frequency of meetings that we hold, but rather the goals need to be common goals, and common culture needs to be upheld. Otherwise, we cannot be effective. And the third key term was also mentioned by the three panelists, openness or transparency. It is not just to publish all the documents, but rather we have to make sure we give easy to understand and necessary information, and interactive communication is also very important. So it was very brief, but it was the summary of today's discussion. So we already went over the scheduled time, so we apologize to the members of the audience. So this concludes the Q&A session. I'd like to thank the three panelists once again. So I'd like to hand back the microphone to Taie-san.
Thank you very much. In closing, we'd like to ask a speaker to take the floor, but before that, we'd like to rearrange the stage. Please wait.
Okay, so thank you very much. So please go back to your stage. Thank you.
Thank you for waiting. In closing, we'd like to ask Mr. Venkachalam Ambupumil, Director, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area.
Good noon, and thank you very much for joining this symposium on the best practices, best regulatory practices that is jointly organized by ERIA and IEEJ. And taking this opportunity, I would like to thank IEEJ for organizing this wonderful symposium, which is very timely and is also sharing this best evolving practices. ERIA is based in Jakarta, and we have been working for the ASEAN countries on key issues that is affecting that energy security, safety, and affordability. When we think about this current outlook for the nuclear energy in Asia, we need to acknowledge that is the policies framework has been impacted by the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident. Although the accident caused no direct radiation-related casualties, it raised concerns over the safety of nuclear power plants and led to this drop in the public acceptance. So ERIA, in cooperation with IEEJ, has implemented several studies on the public acceptance of the nuclear power plants in this region. And we are inspired by Toyoda-san for directing these studies. And this study could not be completed in the last 2 years, and we don't have that kind of interactive public consultation in the last 3 years. And this is today is a kind of a opportunity for us to interact with these different stakeholders that is related to the nuclear safety and the regulatory frameworks. But if you look into this future, the medium and the long term, the outlook for the nuclear power plants in Asia is very positive. And from 2015, there are about 24 reactors that has been commissioned in Asia, or it is planned to be commissioned. And most of them are coming in China, India, and as well as the ASEAN countries. So it is expected that is this addition, that is a capital addition, capacity addition will be improved to about 250 gigawatts by the year 2050, as per the ERIA estimates. So for the countries that is about to embark this nuclear program, today's symposium on the best practices, nuclear best practices, gives a lot of insights. And these countries need to be prepared to set up a new regulatory framework that is combined with this investment framework, and the building the capacities in terms of trained, educated, and competent staff as a part of the regulatory framework is very much essential. So today's presentations given by Magwood about this opening up the channels, the communication channels, and then Mr. Campbell's presentation about the continuous research about the licensing handbook, and as well as the risk-informed regulatory frameworks, as mentioned by Jagal, and is very important. I think we learned a lot from the perspective of these emerging and developing countries. On behalf of the region, I would like to say this nuclear energy will be necessary and imperative in terms of decarbonizing the power sector and moving the countries towards net zero. And here, as we observed, the nuclear safety remains the highest priority for the regulatory frameworks. Although the primary responsibility of the regulatory frameworks lies with the operators, and it has to be developed in consultation with the regulators as well as the public community. That is a message that I learned from today's deliberations. So taking this opportunity, I would like to thank IEEJ and Teresawa-san for taking this initiative. And IRIA is committed to do more research on the public acceptance and the sharing the regulatory best practices, as well as advancing our knowledge, particularly on the technical standards, and as well as the safety requirements for establishing these new power plants in the developing countries. So once again, thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward further interactive dialogues in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Once again, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come to Japan and deliver your lectures. Mr. Magwood, Ms. Jamal, Mr. Campbell, and I'd like to extend my sincerest appreciation to all of you for sparing your time out of your busy schedule. With this, we'd like to close this symposium today. Please make sure you leave the simultaneous translation receiver on the table in front of you, and make sure you have all your belongings with you. Thank you again. With this, we'd like to close this symposium. Thank you.